please ensure your mobile phones are on the silent mode. If you need to have an urgent conversation, please do so outside. Flash photography is strictly prohibited. Please keep the center aisles and the side aisles free. It's for your own safety and security. We're delighted to introduce the harvest. Before that, front lawns is shifted on the right towards the dining place in the dining hall where the delegate lounge was. Charbagh and Fort Samvad are shifted behind front lawns. There's a building, so they're happening inside there. So, harvest, please welcome Jim Grace in conversation with Chandrahas Choudhury, presented by Rajasthan Patrika.
Just let them all sit down. Okay. Okay, Jim, shall we begin?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for braving this wet morning to come see us. I'm sure you've been to a lot of events at this festival, and in literature there's always, in any range, I feel, Jim, in any literary field, there's kind of two extremes. There's two sides to any kind of form, and one might say that for the purposes of JLIF 2014, the two extremes of the kind of novel that have been on view are maybe the Franzenian novel and the Cracean novel. And it seemed to me on reading Harvest, which I enjoyed very much, that with Franzen you have these masses of detail and these huge books, and they're built up with all kinds of stuff, and they're visibly imperfect, and but there's kind of there's apparently kind of ambition in them that's supposed to be respected, but sometimes I feel that when we grant that, we forget that it seems unusual that a novel have a kind of perfection about it, which I really felt that Harvest did. From the very first word, in the very first sentence, when we see in the field of the novel these two spirals of smoke in the air, we are suddenly taken into this world where people learned how to read the world by reading the weather and reading the land. And
well, perhaps we should say something about the weather. I feel thoroughly at home this morning because I feel, I don't know anyone, some of you here, but most of you won't have been to an English literature festival. And this is an exact version of an English literature festival. Everyone is damp and miserable. Everyone is soaked. And the only reason you're in here is to escape the rain. So I feel thoroughly at home. Yes, this business of the long novel. I think writers don't admire the kind of writing they do themselves, or they don't if they're sensible. And it's because, certainly in my case, there's no mystery to what I do. It seems quite easy. I don't know why anyone bothers to read it. I don't know why anyone's nice about it. Because when the writing is going well, it just seems to fall onto the page. The books that I admire are the books by writers who are realists, by writers who don't write thin volumes like me, but do write the big, thick books like Jonathan Franzen. I have never written a book which is longer than 90,000 words, and that's relatively short where novels are concerned. I tell myself that the reason I don't do that is out of consideration to the reader, because I think it was John Updike once said to write a novel, well no, it was Bellow, I think, in his later years, to write a novel more than 200 pages is to hold your reader in contempt. But actually, I think the truth of the matter is why I write short novels, is that I write in very, very rhythmic prose. And I kind of write in the oral tradition, so that there's a music and a melody and a timpani to every sentence that I write. And I promise you that can get on your nerves after 200 pages. There was an English critic called Adam Mars-Jones who's never liked any of my books, but he's not liked them in a very clever way. And he said in some reviews some time back, he said to read a single paragraph of a Jim Crace novel is to invite a migraine. So later today, this morning, I'm going to be reading a paragraph. So anyone who does suffer from migraine, I suggest that you leave now.
In fact, when we came in a bit early and sat there and was listening to the music, I was kind of thinking that if there's one experience out of the writers at the festival that's comparable to that, where every sentence sings, that's in your book. And I also meant to ask you, everyone who arrives at an event like this has already heard about Harvest, knows more or less what the book is about, has read the reviews. But what you're trying to do, I imagine, as a novelist is, when you have a set of readers that have already read your previous books, is for them to go to the bookshop on the first morning and open it and be really surprised by being taken into some place that they had not expected. And that is the case with Harvest, because we don't know for a while where exactly we are and what time in England.
Well, I've said this before at this festival, so excuse me for repeating myself, but that's not repetition, it's consistency. And that is that if you were to think of the conventions of the modern novel, certainly in the United Kingdom, the current convention is that it's autobiographical, and that it's realist, and that it holds a mirror up to a real world so that you feel located in something that you recognize. And that's an incredible skill, to be able to reproduce the world in a convincing way so that we see it freshly but accurately. But the traditions, not the conventions of fiction, of storytelling, before the printed word, is that stuff is invented, that the animals you encounter aren't real, the nations that are described aren't possible, the kings that are talked about and the gods that are talked about don't exist. And that's the world that I inhabit. The pleasure I take, I suppose, is knowing that my readers are going to encounter something that life doesn't offer in its everyday detail. I mean, I hope the emotions and the moralistic tone is recognizable, of course. But in that respect, I mean, people mistake me for being a modernist writer, but actually I'm not. I'm an old-fashioned, traditional storyteller.
Right. But when I hear you speak, don't you think you're just giving the opposition too much praise? You're sounding like Jose Mourinho talking about David Moyes. You're a realist writer too. What is in Harvest that could not be called? There may be other layers to it, but there is, in fact, there's a fantastic realism of agricultural detail which I enjoyed enormously. The sense that you knew what grows on the land, what kinds of clothes they wear. It's a retreat into a world that one would not otherwise know.
Well, I don't really know anything about it. I do make things up.
Yeah.
It's a big mistake to read any of my books as sources of genuine information.
Right, yeah.
I remember I wrote a book about, which was based on food. It was a book called The Devil's Larder. And the reason that I was writing that book about food was because food is so central, of course, this is a truism now, but food is so central to so many aspects of people's lives. You court your first girlfriend or your first boyfriend over a meal. Family rows or family affections are expressed over a meal. The disparities between humankind can be shown through what I have on my table at home and what some people have on their table, say, in South America or in the deepest Africa. So there are so many subjects surrounding food and so many mythologies that it's a perfect vehicle to use as the Trojan's horse in which to smuggle in all sorts of other subjects.
Yes.
I remember doing a reading from this book, and there was a man sitting in the front row making copious notes. And I thought, oh, he's really impressed by me. He's writing down all my aphorisms, and I talked to this man. And afterwards, he came up and asked for a signature, and I said, what were you writing down? And he said, recipes. And I was horrified by this because everything I'd mentioned about food was truly toxic. And I don't mind giving people migraines, but I don't like widowing people all that much. So yes, it's an invented world, and what I'm pleased to say you have presumed was the true detail of agricultural life is is a flight of the imagination.
Okay, but that is the sleight of hand that every fiction writer must prize over everything else, don't you think?
Well, I think so. I mean, you can't tell lies about things that you don't know about. You won't find a convincing lie in my novels about chemistry, say, or motor cars, or higher maths, because even though I might be interested in some of those things, I know nothing about them. But if I have any area of expertise at all, it's in the natural world, natural history, and it's in walking. I'm a big walker, and landscape. Landscape interests me. And so it's kind of quite easy for me to invent places and to invent animals and to invent the natural world as a vehicle for my subject matter.
Well,
I was going to say, we're all the same. I mean, we shouldn't say that it's only writers that do that.
Yeah.
A point I keep on making is that the ability to tell stories is in the hands of everybody in this room. It's what makes us social creatures. It's why we're not bores. It's because when we go home at night and our friends or our wives or our husbands or our children say to us, "What did you do today?" we have the grace in the imagination to turn what happened during the day into a story, into a narrative. We don't bore on about the details. We choose the nuggets that are interesting. And we illustrate it. We sometimes fib a bit. Sometimes if you've had a row at the supermarket and you've made a bit of a fool of yourself, by the time you get home, you've actually been a hero. And you've got a good anecdote to tell. And it's not really lying, it's sociability. That's what we want. I'm making light of it a bit, but we all recognize that.
Because won't you grant that the ability to tell a story and then to write a story convincingly on a page requires making use of finding substitutes for all sorts of things that you use in conversation, you know, the expression of your eyes, a gesture, your accent, which on a page you have to lose so much in trying to write a story, and that requires a certain kind of understanding of craft.
Well, you're absolutely right. You ever see anybody telling an anecdote or a joke in a pub, and they have all of these weapons in their armory, which aren't only words.
Yes.
They're all those other things. And to some extent, I try to employ those in my prose. So I'm always reading aloud what I'm writing. And I always try and give my prose some kind of gesture, an implied gesture in a way. If you listen to a good oral storyteller, you'll hear the way in which the sentences are modulated, in which you get short staccato sentences, then you get the long restful sentence ending in a dead beat. And actually we think, because we hear that in oral storytelling, and we recognize that it doesn't exist very often in the written form, that it only belongs to the oral tradition. But actually it belongs to conversation.
Yes.
You know, you listen to... there's someone playing. Can you hear that feedback?
That's not us.
Oh, good, okay. That's not us, good. If you listen to people, seriously, pay close attention next time you're having a conversation with someone, or listen to the news, and you'll hear how the spoken language is modulated and beautiful. Not always rhyming, but it kind of has a lovely rhythm to it.
Are you saying all spoken language is modulated beautiful, or can you, even in spoken language, isn't it the case rather that we hear some people speak and suddenly aware of how much potential spoken language contains for precisely this beauty you speak of?
Well, some people are better than others, and some languages lend themselves to beauty better than others. I mean, the Arabic language is so beautiful because of the way there are so many similar sounding synonyms, you know, repeated notes in the Arabic language. English can be a bit clumsy and a bit flat, but I promise you it's flatter on the page than it is spoken.
That's right. Well, since you're talking about the musicality of language and employing that in your book, does that make a difference then to how it sounds to the reader if the person who's speaking in this beautiful sound, which does not seem a realist novel sound, does it make a difference if it's a narrator who has that voice or a character in the book, and does it have to be done differently then?
Well, narration choosing a narrator is so interesting and so important. I mean, when you start writing a book, you have to make some as you know, as a novelist yourself, you have to make some important technical decisions early on. You couldn't make a film if you didn't decide where the camera was going to go and whether it was going to be a long shot or a close-up. I mean, we take that for granted. So there's these very important decisions to make. Is it going to be in the present tense, or is it going to be in the past tense? I mean, this current book is in the present tense, and it's a first-person narrator. So those are the two big decisions, present tense or past tense. First-person narrator or third-person narrator. Tense is incredibly important because the default tense of storytelling is the past tense. Once upon a time there was a princess, the past tense. And what the past tense does is it gives all of the power to the narrator, whoever that narrator is. Because whatever is described in the novel or in the story has already happened.
Yes.
It's in the past tense. And so the narrator is all-knowing. There's a famous little story about Groucho Marx, who in his later years, in his 70s or 80s, when he's really grumpy, he goes to a posh woman's New York apartment for a meal in the evening. He's really bored. He hates everyone there. He drinks as much as he can. He eats as much as he can. And he leaves as early as he can. And when he gets to the door to leave, the hostess, the New York hostess, puts her thin sparrow-like arm, jangling with gold, onto his arm. And she says, "Well, Mr. Marx, did you have a nice evening?" And he replies, "Yes, I did, but it wasn't tonight." Now, the wonder of that story is that the moment that she is referring to, "Did you have a nice evening?" is the moment that they've both experienced. But when Groucho Marx says, "Yes, I have, but it wasn't tonight," the having of that nice evening could have been just the night before. It could have been 10 years ago, and it could have been in the Ice Age. The difference between the present tense and the past tense is the thickness of the door to that apartment. But the way I told it to you was in the present tense. Groucho Marx went to a New York department. And that's because the joke is always told in the present tense. And the joke is told in the present tense is because the present tense pretends that the narrator doesn't know everything. And that the narrator is encountering things at the same rate as the reader is encountering it. And so the present tense is more democratic. So that's why that book is in the present tense.
I think that was a wonderful exposition. Well, it is in the present tense, but you say it's first person, yet for most of the first few pages, we don't hear the first person. It's a we who speaks, isn't it?
Yes. Well,
a man speaking as a we, and what does that mean for the book? What does it tell us?
Isn't we the first person? You know grammar better than me, isn't it?
First person plural, so which is something that
plural,
we...
Yes. Again, I'm sorry to give a sort of lecture, but you think about narrators. Very often, Tolstoy, Dickens, Jane Austen, they're hovering above the world. They can see everything and they know everything at the same time. And so anything that's going on in any corner of the world which they're describing, they will know about. So that's the godlike narrator or the hawk-like narrator. And then sometimes you have narrators who are kind of closer to the ground. A famous example is Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby. So he's actually part of the action, but he's not a player. He's just an observer. My narrator is very much part of in the Nick Carraway mold. He only knows what's going on in his life. He doesn't know what's going on in anyone else's life unless he's told about it or unless he sees it from a distance. So it's very, very different. So what I have here then is I have a present tense in which I, the narrator, know nothing. And I have a first-person narrator who himself knows nothing. And so what that does is to contribute to the sense of insularity and claustrophobia in this novel, in which no one knows anything, including the reader.
Okay, we haven't now spoken so far, pleasingly I hope, about the actual material of the novel, and it doesn't just begin in a particular time, which we find out slowly over the course of the book. It also begins at a very particular moment, what you at some point in the book call an unrestful day of rest. So why don't you explain exactly what's going on?
Okay, again, my apologies to anyone that was at the other event, but this is what it is. I come from the West Midlands in England, and well, actually, I don't come from North London, but I've been there for 40 years, so yeah. The fields around Birmingham in the West Midlands are full of what we call ridge and furrow, which are the deep declivities and little hillocks that are formed by ploughing, wide ploughs, ploughed by oxen. What happened in the 16th, 15th, 16th, 17th, early 18th century was that gradually that land was stolen off the farmers who ploughed it and made a modest living, scraped a living, and taken by the landowners to be grassed over for sheep, because sheep could make a big profit. You know, capitalism, the usual story. Now the thing is that the very last time that field was ploughed, those marks remain. And the fields of the West Midlands are full of this undulating pattern, this ridge and furrow, where humankind, hundreds of years ago, has etched its efforts and its toils onto the landscape. You cannot help but walk through these fields and sense the beauty, and sense that a narrative has been etched onto the landscape and that it's glorious. But it's wrong to only see beauty, because this ridge and furrow is also evidence, physical evidence, landscape evidence of a tragedy, of a dispossession. So if you're a writer, you think, well, that's fantastic, because what you're looking for, if you're a writer, are two things to set against each other. And so the idea of beauty versus dispossession cheered me up no end. And so I knew I had a novel there. But I'm not a historical novelist, and I didn't want to resurrect the past. I'm much more interested in current day politics. So the triangulation wasn't there that made me want to write a novel about medieval England. But like a good gift, narrative is such a generous creature. It gives you things. The very same day that I came up with this idea, I read the Guardian newspaper, and there was a story about soya barons in Brazil stealing land from farmers who'd had their land for generations, and they were stealing it in order to grow soya on an industrial level and make profits. So here was the same story, but just 500 years later. And you don't have to hunt very far, I'm sure, in your experiences, whatever country you come from, to find that exact same story happening today, somewhere in the world. And so these are the things about, when there's a golden rule about novels, many golden rules. This is one of the golden rules. And a sensible novelist will observe the golden rules. A great novelist will ignore them. But if there are any sensible novelists in the room and want to know the golden rules, is that when you assemble a novel, you need to know where it's about, who it's about, when it's about. You're making those basic systems. And also in the end, when you've written the novel, you also ought to be able to spot what's it about. And those first three, you can decide coldly beforehand.
Yes.
The where, the who, and the when. That's easy to describe. But the what's it about is something you just pray for. And so, in a way, I'm talking to you with the benefit of hindsight. And the benefit of hindsight is that now I know that it's about the worldwide disposition of people's land.
Yes.
But when I started, I wasn't quite sure. And you grope towards it.
I was reading it, and you come to this moment where and also when you mix what you just said about writing novels with what you said previously about narration, and the narrator not really knowing what's going to happen. So the narrator has this strange sense of foreboding that something terrible is going to happen, and then we suddenly have this line, the sheaf we're going to give way to the sheep, which I think is perhaps so central to your work, it's representative of your work in so many ways, the musicality, the pun, the she sound, and then there's another she behind that, this unknown woman in the text. So I often find that your paragraphs build up to this ringing close, and this happens so many times in the book because there's also other smaller fractures and fissions happening in the text.
Well, it's interesting you should mention the sheaf gives ways to the sheep, because that was one of the first sentences that I wrote down in my notebook, and I thought, God, that's so cheesy. Do yourself a favor and don't use it in the book, because it's kind of a little bit too far, isn't it? The sheaf gives ways to the sheep. This is a writer slapping himself on the back. But in the end, I was weak and I couldn't resist it. So I tried to bury it. I'm glad that it fooled you.
Yes, no, well, I was going to say it was a very astute kind of fooling for the reason that when a line like that taken, quoted out of the book sounds cheesy, like you say,
Yeah.
but when you put it at the bottom of a paragraph, which has its own rhythm, then it's part of that local color. It's like it's been grounded in something, and then it doesn't like jump out so much, isn't it?
No, well, I am self-conscious about overdoing things. I'm aware that I have bad habits. Every writer has bad
Yeah.
habits, and I'm very aware of my bad habits. I'll list them for you. I'm over-moralistic. I mean, I'm quite a cheerful person in life, but as soon as I sit down at the word processor, I behave like a priest, and I want to tell you what to think and what to feel. So that's bad, and I try and resist that. I am also aware that I do overdo the rhythms and the poems and the percussion in my prose. So I try to resist that. I'm also aware that people mistake me for being a pessimistic writer. And I think, I mean, I had someone write to me in a review, and I don't store up bad reviews, but sometimes people will write a review and you have to think about what they've said. And a reviewer, a woman wrote in the Sunday Times that I took a boyish delight in disgust. And I was very shocked by this, because that's actually quite a strong criticism, because in my novels there's lots of unflinching descriptions of things, descriptions of dead bodies, descriptions of things which are notionally ugly. And she was talking about my descriptions of the natural world. And I was quite shocked by this, and didn't want to be thought of as being boyish and disgusting. And then I realized that actually, the reason I was baffled was because I didn't feel the disgust that she was describing. She felt disgust. And the reason that she felt disgust was that she was making the mistake that a lot of people do make, of mistaking the natural world for being rainbows, daffodils, and kingfishers. And if only it were, if only that was all it was, then it would be a simple thing. But the truth of the matter is, as we all know, is that the natural world isn't just sunshine. No, you know, it's as much mud as it is lawn. And it's as much decay as it is life. In fact, it's more decay than it is life. The majority of this globe that we live on is dead. And so, unless you are prepared to embrace all of that, unless you're prepared, as I do, much to my wife's horror, when we're on a country walk, going up to cowpats in order to count the different flies that exist in a single cowpat. And there's, you know, I was talking to someone the other day who'd done exactly that and found 15 different species in a cowpat. Unless you embrace all of that, you're not embracing the natural world at all. However, I overdo it. So that's one thing that I also want to look at. Well, that's enough of my blemishes. There are many more.
That's all, just one?
There were three. You've had three.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's another beautiful moment in the text where you suddenly see that it's been very little time that human beings have been able to see their own world from up above.
Yes.
And there's this moment where this outsider in the village whom they can't really tell, he keeps on walking around the land making these squiggles on a piece of parchment,
Yes.
which you turn into a verb, very nice, or the parchmenting of the land.
Yes.
Suddenly he comes up one day and says, what I'm going to give you is a picture of your land as the stars and the birds see it.
Yeah, I mean, this was another gift that narrative gave me. Actually, on the same day that I read that Guardian article, my wife and I had gone to an exhibition at the Tate Britain Gallery in England, in London, and the exhibition was British watercolours. And the very first watercolour, as I walked in, just as I was thinking about this Ridge and Furrow novel, the very first watercolour, as I turned in on the right, was something I didn't know existed, which was a beautiful painted map in watercolours, in medieval watercolours, from the 1600s, of the enclosure of fields in a town in the East Midlands on the borders of Norfolk. And it just showed the fields in different colours, the way they'd been allotted. And here was another example of a record, a beautiful record of a cruel act. And it was then that it occurred to me, well, how extraordinary that is. Because in the 1600s, the only way you could have a sense of what the world looked like from above in order to draw a map was if you climbed to the top of a tree or if you're on a high hill, none of which exist in Norfolk, of course. And so the human imagination literally is able to soar The human imagination, even before we went into the heavens, was able to imagine what it would be like to look down from the heavens. And so, yeah, that also played into what I was saying about the level of the narrator that you have. So, yeah, that was a key moment.
In the book, we see that something that seems like it's going to be world-ending is happening, to the narrator at least, this villager who has been in this place for so long, which is that the land that he knows and he plows and we have just enough for a meal, for a living, suddenly there's this profit and surplus kind of model being applied to it for the first time. But of course, as you were saying, when you write historical novels, there are reflections of current day problems, not so much exercises in trying to reconstruct a distant past. However, on reading this book in the 21st century, we as a reader know that what to Walter Thirsk, the narrator, is world-ending, is just one of a long line of capitalist shocks. I mean, the sheep will disappear in 20, 30 years too, and there will be a factory on that land.
That's exactly what's happened. Yeah.
And what does that mean then about a larger point about capitalism because there's that I register that sense of protest in your book, but when...
Well, as you know, novels aren't leaflets, they're not placards. And the last thing you want to do in a novel is to send people out of the novel and exclude their own responses and their own sets of beliefs. I mean, I'm very straightforward and dogmatic in my own politics. I sound like a ranting North Korean when I talk politics. But novels have to do something else. Novels have to be more subtle. And novels need to send the reader out asking questions of themselves rather than feeling that they've been shouted at. And so the anti-capitalist message in it, I hope, is slightly muted, but I also want it to be clear at the same time. There are a few themes in this book other than that. There's capitalism, and there's also the way in which, when people are under pressure, when they're ill or there's unemployment or there's a shortage of housing or there's a shortage of food, how there is a tendency to look for scapegoats and to blame others. That's a secondary theme. And there's a third theme as well, because at the end of this book, the narrator, Walter, is forced out of the land that he's grown to love and he's moving on. And it feels as if maybe it's an entirely pessimistic moment, but actually it's mixed with optimism as well, because that's the nature of humankind. There's these strange tugging pressures, I think, that everyone has in their life. This immense love for that acre of the world that we call our own. And that immense curiosity about everywhere else. And so there's a kind of a pressure pushing our shoulders, saying, go somewhere else, have the adventure, see new things, move on, don't be in a rut. And there's an equal pressure from the front, which is saying, stay here, we love you, this is your home. This is where your roots are planted, and this is where your branches flourish.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I think that's what makes us so suspicious when we see something new. That makes us so suspicious when it's not us who goes out to see something new, but something new that enters our universe.
That's right.
And that's precisely what happens in the book, because, and what I enjoyed very much was that in the beginning, we start with this fire on the landlord's farm, and they all go to stanch it, and then the question moves on to culpability. Who was it who did it? And Walter knows, and much of the village knows, that it was a mistake made by some people in the village. But at the same time, you've seen these two outsiders who just set up just on the outskirts of the village. And what I really enjoyed was this slight movement whereby Walter's own ethical sense tells him that he should speak to the landlord, who anyway is a close friend of his, and say, these are the people who did it. But he begins to think it would be better for everybody if it was the outsiders who were charged with it and sent away, so that we keep everything that we have.
See, I don't know if this is a very English trait. I suspect it is, that we're rather cowardly when it comes to speaking our minds. I'm going to generalize awfully here, and I'm going to upset every English person in the room. But sometimes...
There's only a few, I think.
Is it? Okay, good. Sometimes we are more concerned, the British, with protocol, in other words, with politeness, than we are with principle. And I'm guilty of that. You know, how many times have I sat at a dinner table with some appalling old racist or sexist and heard them being unpleasant and ridiculous, and for the sake of the quietness of the evening, said nothing. You know, if you were in Italy or France or America or Brazil or, you know, or Dar es Salaam or whatever, people would pipe up and say, you're talking nonsense, behave yourself, leave the room, apologize to that woman. But in England, we don't. We hate a fuss. And so we sit there and we put up with it. It's one of the things, in a way, which I kind of love about England, because it means that there's a certain guaranteed placidity, which is very civilized. But also there's a heartlessness to it, which I despise. So, yeah, that's the answer to that. I'll probably not be let back into England when I fly back now at the weekend.
There's another bit I really enjoyed where the village people go out to meet these two outsiders for the first time, and although there's dozens of them and only two men whom they don't know, they take all their implements, their spades, their hoes, and Walter is heard commenting, because he doesn't go, we feel naked without our tools, which again seems to me a comment that you could apply to so many other situations about human societies.
Yes, it happens in Birmingham, my home city, where generally we rub along really well, and it's a successful multiracial city, Birmingham, really successful, and we in so many respects, we should be proud of our city, the way in which different tranches of immigrants come in and been embraced. But there are hard times in the West Midlands at the moment, as you understand, and there has been a lot of tension, as you know, particularly between everyone else in the Muslim community. And exactly the sort of thing that you are describing is coming out. Attacks on mosques, attacks on a very innocent 70-year-old man just coming back from the mosque one night, by people who want to take vengeance for some perceived ill fortune in their own lives, by killing on the street a 70-year-old man who's just been praying to God. I mean, you know, and it's happening more and more. And it's the bad times that deliver this kind of revenge, I think.
This may be the right point for me to reveal something about my own past of studying English literature. As undergraduates, we had a very British kind of, if you took an English degree, you had a very British curriculum. You read Thomas Hardy, Dickens, and all these things. Every now and then we would be asked to write something about the Christian element in these novels. And as people who are, like, as somebody who did not grow up at all in that tradition, you just not make any sense of that kind of God, and we always left those questions out and never answered them in our question papers. But what I enjoyed very much about Harvest is that it is definitely a very Christian book. Walter would call himself a believing Christian, as would everybody in the village. But it's a village without a church, because they don't have enough cash and or enough time to set it up. And it's also a village that's so far out, it's separate from the rest of Christianity in a way. It's a kind of distant, almost a heathen Christianity. And Walter himself kind of thinks of God as like a bit distant. He can't quite believe that. He believes in the land more than he does in God, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I guess that's my situation as well. I believe in the land more than I believe in God, sort of as a Darwinist. But I'm not one of these Darwinists that dismisses religion out of hand. That would be ridiculous. Because humankind, you know, if you go throughout the world, the normality of humankind is that they have some belief system. That's not there by mistake. If that was a mistake and it didn't confer on people an advantage, then by pure scientific reasons, pure Darwinism, it would have died out. So even though I'm an atheist myself, I feel a great sodality with the great narrative religions of this world. And I say the narrative religions because there's a storytelling element, as all Hindus in this audience, I'm sure, will recognize. There's a storytelling element in most of these great religions. And so I feel a great connection with them. I might not believe the truth of the stories, but I do believe in the comfort that they provide, and there's a truth in comfort. I wrote a book about Jesus Christ called Quarantine, which is about Christ's 40 days of temptation in the desert. I wrote it as an atheist, and although my intention was not to undermine anyone's belief. And at a prize-giving ceremony, I was approached by the Archbishop of Canterbury of the time, a man called Runcie. And he said that he'd read it, and he said, I hear that you're an atheist. And I said I was. He said, I think that God was standing at your shoulder. The Spirit of Christ is actually what he said, was standing at your shoulder when you was writing. And I said flippantly, but also I meant it. Actually, it was the hobgobbling of storytelling. the mischievous imp of storytelling that was standing on my shoulder. And I think that wasn't just to put him down, it was to say that I think religions have also got a mischievous imp of storytelling standing at their shoulder. Because the great religions understand that if you want to make a moral point, then to have a mischievous story and a memorable story will provide the means by which people start to believe. So I'm very interested in that. I feel that I'm not a co-religionist exactly, but I am somebody that believes in the massive transforming power of storytelling. And so in all of my books, there tends to be a religious element. You were hinting that you wanted me to read that passage,
Yes,
weren't
if you like, yeah.
You want me to or not?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Aspirins ready, please. It's a very, very short section. Section, just a paragraph. And this is talking about, exactly as Chandrahas has said, about the lack of a church in this small medieval village. Our master had never thought it fit to put the pillory, which is the big punishment block, to put the pillory to use since then. It's been our village cross. We've little else. The plot of land that was set aside for a church has nothing on it other than our too many graves, a pile of well-intended but as yet unlaid stones, and somewhere underneath the bracken, sawhocks and willow herb, a flat foundation stone. So far no one has made the time to dig a building trench, select a single flint for our church's walls, or mix a pint of mortar. We do not dare to say we count ourselves beyond the kingdom of God, but certainly we do not press too closely to his bosom. Rather, we are at his fingertips. He touches us, but only just. We work cheek to jowl with breeds that cluck and snort and moo, but never with the Father who created us and them. I've yet to sense him standing at our shoulders, sickle in his hand. I've yet to feel him lightening the plough. No, we dare to think and even say among ourselves, there'd be no barley if we left it to the Lord, not a single blade of it. Well, actually, there'd be no field except a field of byblows and weeds, the nettles and tares, the thorns and brambles. He preferred when he abandoned Eden. You never find him planting crops for us. You never find us planting weeds. But still we have to battle with his darnel and his fumiter. We have to suffer from his fleas and gnats and pests. He makes us pay the penalty of Adam. Sometimes we're thankful that the nearest steeple is a lengthy day away, and so's the nearest alehouse, come to that. We can't afford a living for a priest. We'd prove too small and mean a flock for him. Our umbrage would eclipse our awe. So we continue, not irreligiously, but independently, choosing not to remind ourselves too frequently that there's a heaven and a hell, and that much of what we count as every day is indeed a sin.
Thank you. We continue not irreligiously but independently. That might be the state of 21st century man on average.
Yes, yes. I think that we have to face the fact that as science progresses and science offers such convincing narratives of explanation for the world, that the moment where you can go to the top of a hill last night in the middle of the rain and the thunder and say to your congregation, this is evidence of God's displeasure, or this is evidence of God's indigestion, those moments have gone. In the 15th or 16th century, where there was no global view, those things were very believable. So knowledge and science inevitably forces these mischievous narratives into a corner. And so we need new narratives. I often use the word transcendence and spirituality and such like, because us atheists have no other words. We only have religious words. And that's a great pity, I think, because if the world is going to become increasingly atheistic, and therefore it's going to become less transcendent, then we all lose something. So what we need is new narratives for a world which is less glued to the sense of a real God.
Okay, for my last question, I'm going to make a sudden switch from religion to verbs.
Yeah.
What I really enjoyed about reading this book was, I really enjoyed all your verbs, and there are many moments of really fine writing. For instance, my land-born neighbors are now ditched and fenced against the outside world, or the men there will have chambered and nested her. I put it to you, confirm or deny. The sign of a really good writer is that their verbs are better than other writers.
Well, you invent verbs. And actually, you've hit on something here, because I did that very self-consciously. Again, I'm going to repeat myself, but you all know I'm going to run England down again. But there's an entrenched sense of snobbery in the United Kingdom, which of course is much better than it was years ago. And one of the things is that there's a suggestion that education is the only evidence of intelligence. And this shows itself up in many ways. I mean, my father left school when he was 12 years old because he had osteomyelitis, which is a kind of poliomyelitis of the bones. And so he had hardly any education. And he had to sort of teach himself to read while I was a young man reading well myself. That doesn't mean he didn't have a full set of sensibilities, that he couldn't appreciate art, that he didn't have great wisdom, that he didn't have a big vocabulary. Of course he did. But if you were to say to him, where were you educated, what's your education, people would presume he amounts to nothing. Now there's an example of the form that this takes, in that there's a movement in Britain which said Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare's plays. And it says, how could the modest son of a glove maker from the English Midlands, Stratford-upon-Avon, who had, and this is to quote Ben Jonson, little Latin and less Greek, how could someone like that write those plays which showed such understanding and such sensibility? Now, I'm always really offended by that, because they're saying those plays can only be written by an aristocrat. Oh, show me the books written by aristocrats. They're all buffoons. They can't write. So, I'm from the English West Midlands, and to some extent, if you were to ask me where this book is set, it's not, and when it was set, well, it's not set any particular place, it's not set in any particular time, except that Shakespeare was someone that I wanted to pay attention to. I wanted to sort of suggest that this is the Forest of Arden, the invented, non-specific place which is in Shakespeare's plays. And I also wanted to suggest that the narrator, Walter Thirsk, is an uneducated man who nevertheless has immense sensibilities. And sure enough, some of the snobbish critics who were reviewing this book said, how could an uneducated man with little Greek and less Latin, or whatever it was, like Walter Thirsk, write those beautiful sentences? And that's it, the snobbery still applies. Shakespeare, just to get to the point, Shakespeare loved inventing words. And what he liked doing was turning nouns into verbs. And so as part of the Shakespearean subtext, to which I'm sharing with you today, and which I thought only I knew about, part of the Shakespearean subtext is that what I wanted to do was to find new verbs in nouns.
It really works. It's very, very good.
Thank you.
Well, this has been one of the most pleasurable hours of literary conversation of my life, but I will now ask other people to ask questions of their own if you want to. Yes, you sir in the front, and then after that.
Good morning, Jim.
Hi.
It was a very interesting discussion that you put forward. I come from Australia, and I've done a lot of work with Aborigines in the desert. And one of the things I came across was this idea that you put forward of narrative etched into the landscape. And I found when I was working with Aboriginal artists that they were able to paint their landscape in a hawk-like fashion, even though they didn't travel high up in the sky and have the advantages that we have today to look down on landscape. So it occurred to me when I was observing Aborigines painting that they were able to, in a sense, transcend themselves and allow themselves to range across a landscape which was interior and exterior, and at the same time etch into that landscape their narrative. And so Aboriginal paintings, in a sense, combine both the elevated sense of landscape looking down and the landscape that they walk across, and at the same time a narrative of mythology, which is one of the things that I was exploring It's just an observation I wanted to put it.
This is an incredibly useful observation, and I'm going to steal it and use it next time, because I mean, that's a great example, isn't it? I'm very aware of the sort of paintings that you're talking about and the dreamscapes that you're talking about. Yeah, and it's more and more evidence that actually that's a human trait. It's not just England and Australia. Everywhere we have our imaginations smash down the frontiers of the actual geography of our lives. All of us can do that. It's thrilling. All we want is to have the peace and the food and the income and the peace to allow us to fulfill ourselves as human beings and to encounter all those things. I mean, what we're talking about is, I'm going to sound pious again, but it's a great luxury, isn't it, for us lucky people, to have these unfettered imaginations. It's not the norm in the world, unfortunately.
Yes.
Hi, Jim.
Hi.
You've talked about the process of constructing sentences and talking about paying attention to the rhythms of sentences. I was wondering how much attention do you pay to the sounds of the words, the plosive, guttural, or sibilant sounds of the words, and how important is that in your writing?
Okay, I'll give you an example. In England, when we have damson or plum pie, we have a little rhyme that we use. We eat the plums. You know, you're sitting around as a family, you're eating plum pie with plums from the garden. And when you get the pips, you put them at the side of your plate. And at the end of the meal, the girls, because this is a sexist poem, the girls can tell who they're going to marry, and the boys can tell who they're going to be. Because you count the plums, you say, tinker, tailor, soldier, sailor, rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief. Right? You heard that? That's very rhyming. It's almost perfect. Tinker, tailor, soldier, sailor, rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief. What's the strongest word there? The strongest word, the delivery word, is thief. Just like a little drum beat at the end of a tight rhythm. That's what's glorious about the English language. That a word like thief, with that little faff of an ending, can be so powerful in the presence of words which seem as if they're powerful, behave powerfully because they rhyme. So that's what I look for in a sentence. I look for those thief moments. It's very common in English nursery rhymes. Ring a roses, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. There it is again. The powerful word is the only word that doesn't rhyme, down. It's the word down that delivers it. Listen to the tone of down. Now, not all of those notes are going to be low notes. There are high notes as well. But it's beautiful to play that kind of game. And I overdo it.
Well, we've run out of time. But I do know you want to ask. Why don't you ask a quick question and Jim?
I'll give a quick answer.
Yeah.
Who was that?
Right there at the back.
A follow-up to that theme, for someone coming to one of your books, would you prefer them to read it, or would you prefer them to listen to it, as audiobooks have become an increasingly popular medium for readers and listeners?
Well, I'm a great fan of audiobooks. And my wife and I listen to them in the car when we're over a long journey. There's a kind of problem, isn't there, that when someone's going, when you go and see a film of a movie, everything you didn't know and was free for you to decide, the appearance of the person, the timbre of their voice and everything, all those things that can't be included on the page, they're robbed from you. That person is always going to look like Robert Redford, or they're going to always look like Meryl Streep from now on. So there's a sense of loss. Now, of course, the sense of loss in an audio recording is less. But there is clearly a danger. When you have someone like my first-person narrator, it's not quite sure what his regional voice is. He doesn't have a region. As soon as you start recording, he has to have a regional accent. And so it swings and roundabouts. I think that you gain a lot by hearing the rhythms if it's read well. you lose a lot because some of the mystery disappears.
Very fine. That's all we have time for. I'd like to thank you all for being such a good audience, and especially our volunteers for bringing this together.
Thank you.
I hope you will all read Harvest.
We wish to thank Jim Crace and Chandrahas Choudhury